Hello everybody and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a Rejoinder episode, which this is. We are once again talking to Meghan Lamb about her new book, Mirror Translation, from Blamage Books, and it will be out on March 15. Meghan Lamb is also the author of Coward from Spoyton Doyville from 2022, Failure to Thrive, Apocalypse Party 2021, All of Your Most Private Places from Spork Press in 2020, and Silk Flowers, Birds of Lace in 2017. She served as the Philip Roth Writer-in-Residence at Bucknell University and teaches creative writing through the University of Chicago, Story Studio, and Grub Street. Her work has appeared in Quarterly West, Diagram, Redivider, and Passages North, among other publications. Before we get into my conversation with Meghan, let's remind you how you can support the show for just $2 a month at patreon.com. Patreon.com/NoisemakerJoe. You can get these episodes about a day earlier than everybody else. You can toss me a one-time donation over at paypal.me. You can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's on Amazon. It's pretty good. Or if you want to help but don't have money, which I understand, repost, reblog, retweet, tell a friend in person, on the phone, via text, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, comment, rate, anything that feeds the beast that we know as the algorithm. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Meghan. I have been haunted by Hungary. I think I mentioned this, I actually talked at length about this with Anna Poletti when she was on. One of her characters in Hello World is Hungarian. Hungarian characters feature prominently in David Leo Rice's book, The Berlin Wall. I had been, in the past year or two, reading some Hungarian writers, just kind of because NYRB publishes people from Hungary, and I just will grab an NYRB book, sight unseen. And while nothing in Mirror Translation is like specifically Hungarian, it's Eastern European, and I think people might argue that Hungary is Central Europe, and that's not a particularly interesting debate for me at this point. But that part of the world, it's interesting to me in the current international political climate, especially in the past couple of weeks. I have coworkers whose family are still kind of impacted by the Soviet expansion post World War II, and have very strong feelings about Russia, and all that. So for whatever reason, that part of the world has been looming large in my life for the past couple of years. And we have talked on air briefly about you having spent time in Hungary. So I assume that's where the impetus for the setting of these stories comes from, is your time
there?
there?
Well, it was kind of that time of my life. I also did a lot of traveling in that time of my life. We meaning not me and Robert, but me and my ex-spouse, moved there ultimately, like after my MFA program. I was kind of, and after I did a couple residencies, I didn't have anything lined up and I was wondering what to do. And I got my TEFL certification. This was actually while I was living in Spokane, in the place of my life that inspired a lot of what's in Coward. But I had this TEFL certification. I wasn't sure what, if anything, I ever wanted to do with it, but I got it namely because my ex-husband was kind of addicted to traveling. And when I think about like why he was addicted to traveling, or like what role traveling might have played in his life, like he never really felt comfortable living in a place for more than like 4 months at a time. He was most comfortable when he was moving around, and I think didn't have to think too hard about the future because he was so busy trying to figure out the immediate present, and traveling, at least in the way that he was often having us travel, kept us very focused on the immediate present and didn't allow us to focus on much else. But and he was also like very adamant about like, we get into Europe for some reason and we get money, but then like the objective is to just like flit around as much as possible. And he had lived in Berlin for like a year and a half, several years ago, and kind of romanticized that as like the golden era of his life. Or there were a couple eras of his life that were like the golden era of his life, I think. But in any event, I had taken on a teaching job at U Chicago for a professor who was on sabbatical. I didn't know if it was going to pan out to anything more long-term after that. But I was kind of waiting to hear back from classes and wasn't hearing back. And my ex-husband was getting a little antsy and was like, well, let's move to Europe, or why don't you try to find teaching jobs in Europe? And there were not a lot of positions. Well, I wasn't finding a lot of positions, at least at the university level. And I was adamant that if we moved to Europe, I would be teaching at the university level and not like teaching groups of kindergartners or whatever, just to move to Europe. But I contacted this organization called Central European Teaching Program, and they emailed me back the same day. I think it might have been within hours of me sending out my CV, honestly. They were clearly desperate to fill the position. There was an American who had been living and teaching English composition and English language at a university in Szombathely, which is a small city, I think 15 kilometers from the Austrian border. So it's on the western side of Hungary. But he was leaving, and it was funny, like when I would try to talk to my colleagues at the university about this person, like, what was he like? What did he do while he was here? They were like, I think he was here for 3 years. They're like, no, he was here for 5 years. They're like, no, I think he was here for 7 years. I was like, Jesus Christ, you don't even know how long he was here. It was like, well, what was he like as a teacher? Like, I'm curious, like, how his classes went as I approach taking over all of his old classes that he taught. And they're like, he would go away on weekends and he liked to eat cake. And when I would email him about things going on at the university and like in the apartment that we had moved into, which was his former apartment, he would always have like weird, dodgy responses. So I kind of picture this man just like hiding out in a turret eating cake all day, and nobody knows how long he was even there, which feels very apropos for kind of the atmosphere of the place where I was, or at least my experience of it. But yeah, we ultimately ended up moving there like just as kind of an experiment. Honestly, for me, even at the time, I was thinking, this is my last ditch gesture to try to do something that I think he wants us to do in order to save the marriage. But as soon as we got there, as soon as we put our bags down in the apartment, he looked around and said, I don't like this. And I was like, well, this is where we're going to be for the next year because I work at the university. I was like, no, I don't like this place. We didn't choose this place. So I've spent a lot of time fruitlessly contemplating, like, what did he mean when he said that? I still don't know. I, but yeah, like kind of after he said we didn't choose this place, that was the beginning of 9 months of weird paranoia, like even before the pandemic. Like there was a doorman, sometimes a doorwoman, who was situated right outside of our apartment, and we could kind of hear them like coughing, and like the smoke alarm would constantly go off when they were smoking in the booth. But he was really paranoid about the doorman listening in and hearing our lives inside the apartment, and found it very difficult to sleep. So there was kind of a tinge of like weird mania to all of our interactions, just because his sleep schedule was completely different from mine. He would like be up all night and like go to bed around the time I would wake up, and I would go to the university. I would usually teach 8 classes a day. And I was coming home and spending hours writing cliff notes, because for the first 6 months I was in Hungary, I couldn't get my visa, so I couldn't get paid by the university. Oh. So I needed to do all kinds of weird things to scrap by under the table. Yeah, like he would like get up briefly around the time I would make dinner. Sometimes he would go back to bed for a while after that. But we were like almost never awake at the same time when I was working a regular day-to-day schedule in Hungary. But during my like semester breaks, like my winter break and my fall break, I would get long periods of time, like I think the fall break was like a month and the winter break was like over 2 months. Mm. But during that time, we did a lot of traveling. But like we were traveling like around the Balkans and through Bulgaria, all of these very cold mountainous places in the middle of winter. So yeah, I was living and traveling around with this sleep-deprived man in a very unhappy marriage, and a lot of the things that happen, or a lot of the obviously Mirror Translation like is a heightened reality and like a weird amalgam reality. Like a lot of it is based in Hungary, but also like kind of a combined amalgam of all the places that we were traveling to as well. And part of the reason I did that was because like not just in Hungary, but a lot of the places I would travel, there was kind of this pervasive attitude of like, and a kind of like defensiveness, like, well, things might not be very good here, but at least we're not Poland, or at least we're not Russia, or at least we're not the real bad people. Mm-hmm. I think it's a kind of defensiveness that would like arise as soon as they realized I was American and not British. I also developed a really weird accent that's hard to explain when I was living over there, just because I was speaking English with people who had peculiar accents, not just because they were learning English as a second language, but because when they like first started learning English, they were learning British English, or like English that had a heavily different accent than I spoke with. So I found myself gradually kind of adjusting my own accent and adjusting my own pitch to fit what they were familiar with. And I still feel like I have to correct myself every now and then, or like I see people's eyebrows raised when I say a particular word a really inexplicably weird way. But yeah, sorry, I do so much jumping around when when I'm talking about something that happened in the relatively distant past, but where we were doing a lot of jumping around. But yeah, oh, I was talking about how the world of the book is kind of a heightened reality, but it's also based in my actual experiences in reality. And there's like there's a lot of real experience that inspires every story in that collection. Like the space of memory is very heavily inspired by an actual trip we took to Kruševo to visit the Spomenik in Macedonia. I forget what it's called in Macedonian, but it's like the most famous Macedonian Spomenik. And we actually had a lot of arguments about like, are these monuments or are these spaces of memory, or like that were kind of based on like what either of us had read on blogs, and obviously not any kind of direct experience or meaningful connection with these Spomenics, because we were both Americans and we had found out about them by seeing interesting images on Instagram. Mm-hmm. So we were arguing about something that, well, and that was kind of like how, like when you're living in another country and you know you're a liminal resident, you feel a sense of connection to things that you don't, well, a sense of connection to things by merit of encountering them in physical space and interacting with them and having like even like an emotional response to them, but you still don't actually know anything really about that thing. But yeah, like a lot of that collection is kind of speaking to that feeling as well. But yeah, like that story was based on an actual trip that we took and an actual stripper that we met. The mere translation title story is just kind of based around my own sense of loneliness, and the contact figure, or the first friend, is kind of based on my relationship with my mentor figure from the university, who was like my only friend, but I felt like if she had a choice not to spend time with me, she probably would have not been spending time with me. And around the time the pandemic first started, I was reading a lot about these friend for hire situations. It was more popular situation in parts of Russia, in like cities like Moscow, than cities like Szombathely. But I really understood and was compelled by the idea of going on the internet and hiring someone to be your friend just because you feel so isolated and space and language. And then Al Pacino is based on an actual experience we had visiting another Spomenik that's like an hour and a half outside of Belgrade. We got on this train that took us out to the countryside where the Spomenik was, and my ex-husband insisted that there would be a taxi to pick us up from the train station, because we're so oriented as Americans to think like there's a monument here, there's a major historic landmark. Of course, there are going to be transportation services to take people to the landmark thing. But we got off this train and we were just on a wooden platform. There was like nothing but open, snowy fields and a couple goats, like off like a mile and a half in the distance. It looked like there might be a gas station of some kind. I was like, there are no taxis, clearly. We're walking to that gas station. And when I went to the gas station, the man working there, just like in the story, kind of dropped everything to help us. And he took us to the Spomenic. We ended up like pushing his car up the mountain in the ice and the snow. But he like spent the whole day just kind of catering to us. And after he took us to the Spomenic, he drove us back to his house. Like, and as he was like saying, like he was communicating in very broken English, and I was trying to communicate in very broken Serbian. And I put two and two together that he was taking us back to his house, and I was like, what if he just kidnapped us? And I didn't think that was actually going to happen, but I kind of had a laugh in my head about it. But when we got back, his wife kept making food for us. A lot of it we couldn't eat because we're both vegans. But I was trying to make conversation, but there was limited conversation to be had. They had a teenage son who's kind of a bit of the inspiration for the son in the story. But he was taking English lessons, but his English wasn't like strong enough to really communicate meaningfully. But they turned on the TV and there was some overdubbed, I think it was Die Hard, or they were watching a bunch of action movies and kind of like flipping back and forth between them. But I knew bits of the movies, like I knew bits of like what they would be saying in English. So I was kind of like acting them out along with the movies that they were playing on the screen. And at that point, it kind of a flicker of, I wondered, like, what if they have kidnapped us and this is just your lot in life from now on? You perform action movies in English that have been overdubbed. And that was kind of where my imagination of the bizarre situation of Al Pacino came from. I wish they had been watching Dog Day Afternoon. For some reason, just the idea of like role playing as Al Pacino really amused me. But yeah, I guess this is all to say, like, a lot of those stories came from an overlapping sense of alienation and disorientation that I felt like living in the part of the world where I understood just enough to understand how little I understood. And having that same sense in a different way in my marriage that I knew probably wasn't going to last after I left.
Yeah. Al Pacino, I think, is, for me, the most legitimately terrifying of the three. The Space of Memory and Mirror translations are horror to me in the way that I find horror enjoyable. Like, it's like a very familiar sort of Cronenbergian, gray black buildings, and the space doesn't really make sense. You're finding yourself in hallways and going up and down stairs, and suddenly you're in a place you don't belong, and how did I get here? Al Pacino reminded me of a YouTube video by Super Eye Patch Wolf called Social Anxiety Horror, where he talks about a movie that I can't remember the title of now, but it's essentially this couple meet this guy and he's very charismatic, and he kind of is so charismatic and they're so polite that they can't find themselves able to say no to anything that he suggests, and it keeps escalating into worse and worse situations. And Al Pacino reminded me of that, where it's like, if it were me in a situation like that, like, I do feel like in a country where I did not know the language, I could easily be kidnapped and made into some sort of slave just because I'm like, well, I don't want to be insensitive to your culture. I don't know. Maybe keeping me locked up in the basement is like whatever. It also reminded me of the movie Dogtooth.
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah, that very sort of weird, like...
I rewatched Dogtooth just before I started writing that story because I knew that there would be some flicker of inspiration to be found in there.
Okay, cool. I'm glad I linked onto that. It's like this weird kind of patriarchal figure who like can turn his own little family unit into its own cult is really wild to me. And I guess if you're living out in the middle of a field and, you know, some former Soviet nation, maybe it's easier to do than like America or something. I guess that's the difference between like the early Yorgos Lanthimos and like David Lynch. As David Lynch is very like suburban and Dogtooth was very sort of isolated. But yeah, like that's so horrifying because it's like, and Mirror Translations touches on it too, the weird sort of like American guilt that you have, where Anna says like, oh, we'll go to the Genocide Museum, you'll like that because you're American. And it's like, wait a minute, what is that? What could that possibly mean? But like, absolutely, like, I mean, I guess to stay on movies that that
you'll like the Genocide Museum because you'll understand that.
Right. But that Jesse Eisenberg, Kieran Culkin movie is kind of that same thing where it's like trauma tourism sort of thing. And like for me, that all hits really hard because I was raised Catholic. I spent my formative teenage and early 20 years on like social justice Tumblr as a white man. Like throughout my entire life, everything has been pointing me toward this idea that like you're bad and everything you do is violent somehow and there's nothing you can do that'll ever be good. And I remember going to I went to the UK for work just before the pandemic also. So we might have been in Europe at around the same time. And we were filming a pilot of a TV show in a Sikh temple, a Gurdwara. And they kept trying to give me food. And I was like, oh, no, that's okay. Like, I had one plate. I'm good. I don't want to be a bother, whatever. And the guy who was in charge of everything, the executive producer, director, was from Mexico. Obviously, the guy who we were filming being there was Indian. We had an indigenous woman with us and another Indian woman, and they all looked at me at one point and were like, dude, what is your problem? And I was like, oh, I'm just being polite. And they're like, no, you eat the food that's put in front of you. What are you talking about? And I was like, no, I was always raised to like not be a bother. Like, oh, just, you know, one plate of food, one cup of tea, and like and I'm fine. And they're like, no, you need to to eat everything they give you.
Quite the opposite. It's terrifying to be served food in a situation like that and not be able to eat it and not really have the language capability to explain why.
Yeah. Oh, I can't even imagine that. Like, strict adherents to Sikhism are vegetarian. So like I had no... I'm not vegetarian, but had I been, it would have been fine. I guess if I had been vegan, I could have asked for no milk in the chai, but yeah, like it's so... I remember hearing years and years and years ago, probably back in like the late 90s when I was a small child, that like if you're a businessman and you go to Russia, they like give you a pamphlet. Your business will like give you a pamphlet of like things to not do in Russia, up to and including like crossing your legs because showing the bottoms of your shoes is impolite or something. And like kind of wished that like I was given one of those everywhere I went. Like that'd be so great. I remember going on a similar shoot for a similar pilot around the same time to a reservation. And I again asked the executive producer, like, okay, dog, like, I'm a white guy coming here. Like, what do you have to tell me to, like, make sure that I don't do anything wrong? And he's like, well, you're just going to be happy to be there, right? And I was like, well, yeah, of course. And he's like, well, just do that. Also, some people don't like it when you look in the eyes. It depends if they were raised on the res or not. And I was like, how am I going to know that, dog? And we ended up talking to this woman who was like telling me about visions she had been given. She was an elder in the community, and she was telling us, this group, but she kept like leaning into me and trying to like look me in the eyes to do it. And I was like, I don't know if this is okay. And all of that came flooding back reading El Pacino. It was just like, oh, it's so weird. Especially back in my, mid 20s, I guess it would have been at that time, where I was just so uncomfortable existing in the world in general.
There's a particular kind of, like, as you were saying, almost, servile sensation of reality that you kind of find yourself moving into when you are in a situation where, like, for other reasons, you're so reliant on your point of contact, or like I was really scared and anxious in that situation where this man had kindly helped us and like escorted us around the whole day, but it was like, I don't know what I owe you now. Like, and I don't know how I'm supposed to repay your kindness. And I really don't know what the protocol here is. And you have complete authority to establish it. And I don't know what's at stake either, like if I fuck up.
Yeah, absolutely. It also reminded me of a story. I can't remember this guy's name either. He was like the first person to travel to every country without using an airplane or something like that. And he has a story in his TED Talk about riding a bus in like Iraq. And it probably would have been like 2002, 2003. And some old woman was sitting in front of him and kept glancing back at him. And then at some point she hands him a telephone and he grabs it and is like, hello. And this young man's voice introduces himself and he's like, my mother is sitting near you on the bus and she's concerned for your health because you're so pale. So she is going to lead you to our house and we're going to give you dinner tonight. And it was like the big sort of climax of the TED Talk of like, you can't judge a country based on the actions of its government or whatever. And like, it's a nice story, but again, for me, like, I've only ever been to America, Canada, and the UK, right? Like, everybody knows what I'm saying at any point in time. I never really look that out of place beyond dressing kind of weird in general. So there's always going to be like a safety there. But like, it's just like, that's so nice of that woman to be so kind. And you hear that about like, I feel like you hear that about the poorer nations a lot, that, everybody's super charitable. And I had a friend who like got lost in the middle of the night in Palestine and with like an expensive camera around his neck. And some guy asked him if he needed help and he was kind of scared. And he's like, oh, don't worry. Like, in our community, nobody steals from anybody because that like ruins the entire family's reputation. So you're never going to be in danger from us. Don't worry about it. And, obviously your experience in Eastern Central Europe of having just somebody be like, oh, this person is clearly lost, I will do what I can for them. But yeah, I guess, we also have like, again, not just the American guilt, but the American fear too, of like, this is the beginning of every story of some young traveling woman who gets murdered. She's like so grateful to have help in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of the night or in a rainstorm or something. And it's just somebody taking advantage of it. And maybe we're like unduly just terrified of Eastern Europeans because we've been taught to like fear the Soviets so bad or whatever.
Yeah, and they don't quite know what to think of us either for all kinds of good reasons. Like when someone hears you speaking English or hears you speaking their language with a really thick accent, their radar is beeping and they're trying to like get a read on what you're all about as well. And I think there's a weird tension in those kinds of interactions that I'm really interested in. Like that moment at the beginning of Al Pacino with the guy on the train is based on an interaction I had with a guy, or an amalgam of interactions with guys I had on the train, I think before they realized that the guy, or one of the guys started talking to me when my husband went to the bathroom and wasn't around, and I think he thought I was alone. But yeah, like sometimes they are curious about you because you're an American. Sometimes they want to cast some kind of aspersions because you're an American. And sometimes they're really just trying to figure out where your loyalties are because you're an American. So many times I would meet someone in the Balkans or in Bulgaria or in Croatia or oh gosh, sorry, my shoulders popped. But so several times I would like meet someone and they'd find out I was an American. Their immediate next question would be, do you like Donald Trump? Or I would always wonder how to proceed because usually they wouldn't like him. But I found it interesting too, like in Hungary, I think we talked about this on a previous episode, but my colleagues and like other people I would interact with were very eager to denounce Trump, but they you could not talk about the resemblances between Trump and Orban, even though there are many, like to the degree that there are factions of the alt-right that have like meetings and conventions in Hungary because they really like the way things are going there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not the best person to speak toward the direct political resemblances between Hungary and quote unquote that part of the world in general and our part of the world, quote unquote. But I was more interested in that there are these resemblances, but people on both sides of the mirror either don't want to look at those resemblances or have blind spots toward those resemblances, or for one reason or another can't recognize resemblances that are looking right back at them. But yeah, I would usually say like, no, I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like him either. He's a bad guy. And usually they'd be relieved, but sometimes that would just lead to more eyebrow raising. Like, well, what kind of American are you then? I don't even know what to expect now that I know you don't like the one person I really feel like I understand over there.
Yeah. I had a couple conversations like that in the UK where I was like, oh, my politics are weird for America. So they were like, well, how do you feel about things there? And I was like, well, I'm going to tell you how I feel about it, but I want you to know that it's like a very unusual sort of perspective for America. Because
it's very strange to have to be the representative of
Yeah.
something that you don't identify with.
Right. It's like, I don't like Republicans or Democrats. For like, I don't know, I guess very European reasons. Like maybe I'm going to sound more like historical figures that you might recognize than any American ones. But at the same time, like, it's weird to me. Some store clerk asked me where I was from, and I told her Michigan, and she was like, well, I don't know where that is. And I was like, what? That's like the most notable place in the world, isn't it? It's the one that looks like a hand. Everybody knows that.
It is very funny, though, what people, particularly like from Hungary, like in a part of Hungary that's not like super urban or like an international city like Budapest. Like I asked my students a couple times, like, if you could go anywhere, I think this was for like some language exercise. Like this wasn't just an organic question that I was posing to the class. But I asked them, like, if you could go anywhere in the US, where would you go? If you ever have plans to visit the US. And one of my students, like the young man in Al Pacino, said, I would go to Delaware because it is by the sea. I was like, yes, it is. So are a lot of other places that are less Delawarean. And I think one of my other students said she would go to Iowa because what's his face from Slipknot is from Iowa. There were a lot of Slipknot and like nu metal fans in general among my students in Hungary. It's a very popular genre of music. Yes,
that feels very correct. I definitely had a response like that when I was a teenager, and high school or middle school getting to know you days where it's like, where would you like to go? And I was like, Norway. Oh, why is that? Black metal. And then, and then I proceeded to make no friends. But yeah, it's all very weird. I think something that popped in my mind a couple minutes ago was this idea that I've expressed at several points on this podcast and kind of throughout my entire life to any people I feel close enough to tell, is this idea of not feeling like I have a culture to tie myself to. Like, American culture is, I think, hard to grasp. And if you can grasp it, you need to be a certain type of person to really appreciate what that culture is. And I'm not that type of person. And I'm, enough generations away from my immigrant ancestors to, like, the only Polish anything in my life is kielbasa at family, get-togethers. And so it's strange because, like, feeling like an American for me doesn't really mean very much. The same way that, like, the way we've kind of organized gender discourse makes it so that feeling like a man to me doesn't feel like very much. And it feels like other places, and I guess just because I don't know tons of people from other places, feel like there is like a unified something or other. And I remember hearing that too, like people on the film crew in the UK would like ask people, oh, what are people here like this, or like at least within like the realm of like what is the Indian British community, the Sikh Indian British community, what do you guys feel about this? And the answer was always this sort of unsatisfying. It's like, well, it depends on who you talk to. But yeah, like the feeling of identity with regard to anything outside of myself, be it my attributes or setting or whatever, has always been a slippery thing. And depending on my mood and mental health, is either very frustrating or very liberating.
Yeah, and it's when you go into another country and you're going to be there for a while, and you're kind of in a state of immersion, whether you like it or not, people will tell you or show you what category they put you into. And it might not always be what you would consciously align yourself with, or what you would have any way of expecting.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of I think we get around to the title of the collection then, right? Like that's kind of what the mirror translation is it's these people, well, the protagonists kind of realizing that they're not who they think they are, and then other people telling them what they are, or like stripping away, right? Like in the space of memory, the protagonist is kind of like pushed out of his body, right? He's like pushed out of himself.
Yeah. It's funny. Like I think we talked about this on the Rejoinder, but a lot of people who read Coward interpreted the zombies, like the unhoused people milling around, and the particular figure that the book follows as like literal zombies. And that wasn't necessarily the way I was thinking of them, but I really like that reading, and I think there's definitely room for it. And in a similar way, like I don't know that I was necessarily conceptualizing the shift that happens at the end of Space of Memory as like a zombie shift, but I think there's definite room for that interpretation. I imagine it kind of as like the ending of Being John Malkovich, where the puppeteer gets like sucked into the daughter's subconscious and is kind of like conscious of what's going on but can't control the body. I was going to originally write other sections, or maybe some frame sections that featured the weird body husk wandering around the city. But I didn't do that in part because it would have been such a struggle to not make the book about a particular city then. I also didn't want, I think I struggled with the idea of like, if I show him, then you're going to know too much about what happens to him.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked where it ended. Very sort of like, I don't know, movie reference, like closing the door in The Godfather, where it's just like, all right, you've seen enough of this place, reader. Like, you weren't supposed to really be here in the first place, so bye-bye.
But yeah, I think like part of what I guess I was hoping to investigate, or attention that's behind those stories for me, is the idea of not just like looking back and seeing a kind of reflection, but there being this kind of like mystery about what's on the other side. Even though you can see the surface, you know that there's some like looking glass world on the other end of things that you could get unwittingly sucked into. And then you don't have any control over what happens then.